Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 21. Shay's Rebellion, the Articles of Confederation, Northwest Ordinance, the Constitution, and Homosexuality. Never forget the importance of the storyteller. Looking at not just what was important to them, but why it would be, is a far higher level of mastery. We value the things we want to remember, but we soon lose the things we do not. The more voices we keep, the more of a complete picture we will begin to form. Born in Massachusetts in 1747 to Irish immigrants, Daniel Shays was a landless farm laborer when the Revolutionary War broke out. He joined the local militia, fought in the battles of Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Lexington, and rose to captain's rank in the 5th Massachusetts Regiment. He was wounded in battle and never got paid for his military service. When in 1780 he returned home to Brookfield, a rural area west of Boston, he found that he was being taken to court for debts that were unpaid while he was off fighting the war. Since he had not been compensated for his service, he had no way of paying these debts. After attending several town meetings, Shay discovered that many other veterans and farmers were in the same situation. They banded together to petition Massachusetts state legislature for debt relief. The Congress was at the time dominated by Eastern banking and merchant elites who did not understand the plight of rural communities. All proposals for debt relief were rejected. Massachusetts Governor John Hancock, signer of the Declaration of Independence, had refused to prosecute debtors for back taxes, but in early 1785, perhaps anticipating trouble ahead, he resigned his post, claiming poor health. He was replaced by James Baldwin, who took a much more aggressive approach. While Baldwin initiated civil actions to collect delinquent tax debt, the state legislature imposed even more taxes. The protest movement, in which Shay took an active part and eventually assumed a leadership role, revived the American Revolution's rhetoric and the colonists' grievances with British rule. Rural laborers opposed the economic policies and perceived corruptions of Massachusetts state politics. Having just fought a revolution inspired in large part by opposition to British tax policies, they resented the states levying a burdensome taxes and the terms of credit imposed by the banks. Job Shattuck, a farmer in Groton, led a protest in 1782, during which he and his followers physically prevented tax collectors from collecting on rural workers. The following year, in the town of Uxbridge, a mob seized confiscated property and returned it to its former owners. In August 1786, the Massachusetts legislators adjourned without addressing the petition of debt relief for the state's rural communities. On August 29, a group of protesters calling themselves the Regulators converged on Northampton to stop the county court from convening. In response, Governor Baldwin drew up contingency plans to use the militia to quash any such actions in the future. On September 5th, protesters shut down the court in Worcester, and Governor Baldwin ordered the militia to quell the protest. The militia, however, sympathized with the protesters and refused the governor's order, leading Baldwin to recruit and fund a new private militia. On January 25, 1787, Shay led a group of nearly 1,200 protesters marching to Springfield's Federal Armory. Baldwin's private militia was waiting for them, and the result skirmish left 4 of Shay's followers dead and 20 wounded. Popular uprisings like Shay's Rebellion raised the urgent question of whether the democratic governments formed after the American Revolution could survive. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had minimal powers. It did not have the authority to fund troops to suppress the rebellion, nor was it empowered to regulate commerce and mitigate rural workers' economic hardships. The general, George Washington, came out of retirement to promote a strong national government capable of dealing effectively with popular discontent. Shay's rebellion led Washington and other nationalists, including Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, to proclaim the Articles of Confederation inadequate and urge support for the Congressional Convention's Constitution in 1787. The specter of armed upheavals like that led by Shay's strengthened the convention's delegates' conviction that the national government needed to be more powerful. Moreover, it changed the opinion of those delegates who had been arguing on behalf of the more limited government powers under the Articles of Confederation. As a direct result of Shay's rebellion, the U.S. Constitution granted the states powers to suppress future violence. In 1788, Daniel Shays was granted a pardon by the state of Massachusetts. He was able to return home from Vermont, where he had been hiding out in the woods. He was also belatedly paid for his 5 years of service in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. The Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union was the first written constitution of the United States. Written in 1777 and stemming from wartime urgency, its progress was slowed by fears of central authority and extensive land claims by states. It was not ratified until March 1, 1781. Under these articles, the states remained sovereign and independent, with Congress serving as a last resort on appeal of disputes. Significantly, the Article of Confederation named the new nations the United States of America. Congress was given the authority to make treaties and alliances, maintain armed forces, and coin money. However, the central government could not levy taxes and regulate commerce. These issues led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to create new federal laws under the United States Constitution. From the beginning of the American Revolution, Congress felt the need for a stronger union and a more powerful government to defeat Great Britain. During the early years of the war, this desire became a belief that the new nation must have a constitutional order appropriate to its republican character. A fear of central authority inhibited creating such a government, and widely shared political theory held that a republic could not adequately serve a large nation such as the United States. The legislators of a large republic would be unable to remain in touch with the people they represented, and the republic would inevitably degenerate into tyranny. To many Americans, their union seemed to be simply a league of confederated states, and their Congress a diplomatic assemblage representing 13 independent policies. The impetus of an effective central government lay in wartime urgency, the need for foreign recognition and aid, and the growth of national feeling. Altogether, 6 drafts of the Articles were prepared before Congress settled on a final version in 1777. Benjamin Franklin wrote the first and presented it to Congress in July 1775. It was never formally considered. Later in the year, Silas Deane, a delegate from Connecticut, offered one of his own, which was followed still later by a draft from a Connecticut delegation, probably a revision of Deane's. None of these drafts contributed significantly to the 4th version written by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, which, after much revision, provided the basis of the Articles approved by Congress. Dickinson prepared his draft in June 1776. It was revised by a committee of Congress and discussed in later July and August. The 3rd version of Dickinson's original was printed and enabled Congress to consider it further. In November 1777, the final articles, much altered by this long, deliberative process, were approved for submission to the states. By 1779, all the states had approved the Articles of Confederation except Maryland. Still, the prospects for acceptance looked bleak because claims to western lands in other states set Maryland in stiff opposition. Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Connecticut, and Massachusetts claimed their charters to extend to the South Seas or to the Mississippi River. The charters of Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Rhode Island confirmed those states to have a few hundred miles of the Atlantic. Land speculators in Maryland and even others landless states insisted that the West belonged to the United States, and they urged Congress to honor their claims to western lands. Maryland also supported the demand because nearly Virginia was dominated by neighbor should its claims be accepted. Eventually, Thomas Jefferson persuaded his state to yield its claims to the West, provided that the speculators' demands were rejected and the West was divided into new states, which would be admitted into the Union based on equality of the old. Virginia's action persuaded Maryland to ratify the Articles, which went into effect on March 1, 1781. The weakness of the Articles of Confederation was Congress was not strong enough to enforce laws or raise taxes, making it difficult for the new nation to repay its debts from the Revolutionary War. There was no executive or no judiciary, two of the three branches of government we have today, to act as a system of checks and balances. Additionally, several issues were not settled with ratification. A disagreement over the appointment of taxes forecasted a division over slavery in the Constitutional Convention. Dickinson's draft required the states to provide money to Congress in proportion to the number of their inhabitants, black and white, except Indians not paying taxes. With large numbers of slaves, the southern states opposed this requirement, arguing that taxes should be based on white inhabitants. This failed to pass, but eventually the Southerners had their way as Congress decided that each state's contribution should rest on the values of its land and improvements. In the middle of the war, Congress had little time and less desire to take action on such matters as the slave trade and fugitive slaves, both issues receiving much attention in the Constitutional Convention. Article 3 describes the Confederation as, quote, a firm leadership of friendship, end quote, of states for the common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. This league would have had a unicameral Congress as the central government institution. As in the past, each state had one vote, and the state legislators elected delegates. Under the Articles, each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. The old weakness of the First and Second Continental Congress remained. The new Congress could not levy taxes, nor could it regulate commerce. Its revenue would come from the states, each contributing according to the values of privately owned land within its borders. But Congress would exercise considerable powers. It was given jurisdiction over foreign relations with the authority to make treaties and alliances. It could make war and peace, maintain an army and navy, coin money, establish a postal service, and maintain Indian affairs. It could develop admiralty courts, and it would serve as a last resort on appeals of disputes between the states. Decisions on certain specified matters, making war, entering treaties, regulating coinage, for example, required the consent of 9 states in Congress, and all others required a majority. Although the states remained sovereign and independent, no state was imposed restrictions on the trade or the movement of citizens from another state not set in its own. The Articles also required each state to extend full faith and credit to the judicial proceedings of others, and the free inhabitants of each state were to enjoy the privileges and immunities of free citizens of the others. Movement across state lines was not to be restricted. To amend the Articles, the legislators of all 13 states would have to agree. Like many in the Articles, this provision indicated that powerful provincial loyalties and suspicions of central authority persisted. In the 1780s, the so-called critical period, state actions powerfully affected politics and economic life. For the most part, the business prospered and the economy grew. Expansions into the West proceeded and the population increased. However, national problems persisted as American merchants were barred from the British West Indies, and the British Army continued to hold posts in the Old Northwest, which was named American territory under the Treaty of Paris. These circumstances contributed to a sense that constitutional revision was imperative. Still, the national feeling grew slowly in the 1780s, although significant efforts to amend the Articles to give Congress the power to tax failed in 1781 and 1786. The year after the failure in 1786, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia and effectively closed the history of government under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution. The United States Constitution established America's national government and fundamental laws and guaranteed certain basic rights. It It was signed on September 17, 1787, by delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Under America's first governing document, the Articles of Confederation, the national government was weak and states operated like independent countries. At the 1787 convention, delegates devised a plan for a stronger federal government with three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, along with a system of checks and balances to ensure no single branch would have too much power. The preamble outlines the Constitution's purpose and guiding principles. It reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of our liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." The Bill of Rights were 10 amendments guaranteeing basic individual protections, such as freedom of speech and religion, that became part of the Constitution in 1791. To date, there are 27 constitutional amendments. America's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, was ratified in 1781 when the nation was loose confederations of states, each operating like independent countries. The national government was comprised of a single legislature, the Congress of the Confederation. There was no president or judicial branch. The Articles of Confederation gave Congress the power to govern foreign affairs, conduct wars, and regulate currency. However, these powers were sharply limited in reality because Congress had no authority to enforce its requests to the states for money or troops. Soon after America won its independence from Great Britain with its 1783 victory in the American Revolution, it became increasingly evident that the young republic needed a stronger central government to remain stable. In 1786, Alexander Hamilton, a lawyer and politician from New York, called for a constitutional convention to discuss. The Confederation Congress, which in February 1787 endorsed the idea, invited all 13 states to send delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia. On May 25, 1787, the Constitutional Convention opened in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been adopted 11 years earlier. There were 55 delegates in attendance, representing all 13 states except Rhode Island, which refused to send representatives because it did not want a powerful central government interfering in its economic business. After leading the Continental Army to victory during the American Revolution, George Washington, who had become a national hero after leading the Continental Army, was selected as president of the convention by unanimous vote. Delegates, who became known as the framers of the Constitution, were a well-educated group that included merchants, farmers, bankers, and lawyers. Many had served in the Continental Army, colonial legislators, or the Continental Congress, known as the Congress of the Confederation as of 1781. In terms of religious affiliation, most were Protestants. 8 delegates were signers of the Declaration of Independence, while 6 had signed the Articles of Confederation. At the age of 81, Pennsylvania's Benjamin Franklin was the oldest delegate, while most of the representatives were in their 30s or 40s. Political leaders not in attendance at the convention included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, who served as U.S. Ambassador to Europe, John Jay, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock were also absent from the convention. Virginia's Patrick Henry was chosen to be a delegate but refused to attend the convention because he didn't want to give the central government more power, fearing it would endanger states and individual rights. Reporters and other visitors were barred from the convention sessions held in secret to avoid outside pressures. However, Virginia's James Madison kept a detailed account of what transpired behind closed doors. In 1837, Madison's widow Dolly sold some of these papers, including his notes from the convention debates, to the federal government for $30,000. Congress had tasked the delegates with amending the Articles of Confederation. However, they soon began deliberating proposals for an entirely new government form. After intensive debate, which continued throughout the summer of 1787 and at times threatened to derail the proceedings, they developed a plan that established 3 branches of national government: executive, legislative, and judicial. The system of checks and balances was put into place so that no single branch would have too much authority. The specific powers and responsibilities of each branch were also laid out. Among the more contentious issues was the question of state representation and the national legislature. Delegates from larger states wanted to determine how many representatives a state could send to Congress, while small states called for equal representation. The Connecticut Compromise resolved the issue, which proposed a bicameral legislature with proportional representation of the states in the lower house, the House of Representatives, and equal representation in the upper house, the Senate. Another controversial topic was slavery. Although some northern states had already started to outlaw the practice, they went along with the southern states' insistence that slavery was an issue for individual states to decide and should be kept out of the Constitution. Many northern delegates believed that without agreeing to this, the South wouldn't join the Union. For taxation and determining how many representatives a state could send to Congress, it was decided that enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Additionally, it was agreed that Congress wouldn't be allowed to prohibit the slave trade before 1808, and states were required to give fugitive enslaved people to their owners. By September 1787, the Congress' 5-member Committee of Style, Hamilton, Madison, William, Samuel Johnson of Connecticut, Governor Morris of New York, and Rufus King of Massachusetts, had drafted the final text of the Constitution, which consisted of some 4,200 words. On September 17, George Washington was the first to sign the document. Of the 55 delegates, a total of 39 signed. Some had already left Philadelphia, and 3, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, refused to approve the document. For the Constitution to become law, it then had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. With the assistance of John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, wrote a series of essays to persuade people to ratify the Constitution. The 85 papers, known collectively as the Federalists, or the Federalist Papers, detailed how the new government would work and were published under the pseudonym Pluribus, or Latin for public, in newspapers across the state starting in the fall of 1787. People who supported the Constitution became known as Federalists, while those who opposed it because they thought it gave too much power to the national government were called Anti-Federalists. On December 7th, 1787, 5 states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut, ratified the Constitution quickly. However, other states, especially Massachusetts, opposed the document. It failed to reserve undelegated powers to the states and lacked constitutional protections of fundamental political rights, such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press. In February 1788, a compromise was reached under the Massachusetts and other states would agree to ratify the document with the assurance that amendments would be immediately proposed. The Constitution was thus narrowly ratified in Massachusetts, following the Maryland and South Carolina. On June 21st, 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the document and was subsequently agreed that the government under the U.S. Constitution would begin on March 4, 1789. George Washington was inaugurated as America's first president on April 30th, 1789. In June of that same year, Virginia ratified the Constitution, and New York followed in July. On February 2nd, 1790, the U.S. Supreme Court held its first session, marking the date when the government was fully operative. Rhode Island, the last holdout of the original 13 states, finally ratified the Constitution on May 29, 1790. In 1789, Madison, then a member of the newly established U.S. House of Representatives, introduced 19 amendments to the Constitution. On September 25, 1789, Congress adopted 12 amendments and sent them to the states for ratification. 10 of these amendments, known collectively as the Bill of Rights, were ratified and became part of the Constitution on December 10, 1791. The Bill of Rights guaranteed individuals certain basic protections as citizens, including freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to bear and keep arms, the right to peaceably assemble, protection from unreasonable search and seizure, and the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. For its contributions to the drafting of the Constitution and its ratifications, Madison became known as the Father of the Constitution. Northwest Ordinance. In its brief existence, the Confederation Congress passed little legislation of lasting import. One of the few exceptions was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which controlled the Midwest states' admission and laid the legal groundwork for their functioning. One of Thomas Jefferson's often overlooked accomplishments is the work that he devoted to this plan. Less renowned but equally important advocates were Nathan Dane and Rufus King. The ordinance applied to the Northwest Territory, which consisted of the entire Midwest located east of the Mississippi River. It had been decided in other acts that the United States' western areas should be admitted as separate states and that the currently recognized states would not expand. The Northwest Ordinance laid out details of the admissions process. When a territory reached 60,000 people, it could create a constitution and apply for statehood. This procedure was first used in Ohio in 1803 and served as a continuing model for the United States remainder. Any man who owned 50 acres of property in the Northwest Territories was entitled to a vote. More property had to be held to qualify for service in government. These restrictions were commonplace for the United States before Jackson's age and were designed to restrict the influence of popular passions in the new republic's functioning. Slavery and involuntary servitude were forbidden in the Northwest Territories, thereby making the Ohio River a natural dividing line between the free and slave states of the country. Unanimous consent from the states was required for the Northwest Ordinance to be passed. Thus, one might ask, why did the southern states agree to this provision? There are a couple of main reasons. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government's power to potentially curtail slavery in the southern states was almost non-existent. The paranoia that would later define free and slave states' balance was not yet in full force. Slavery had been established in Kentucky and Tennessee. It was also evident for the remainder of the South would be allowed to adopt the practice without issue. Secondly, the primary crop of most plantations at the time was tobacco. This was a crop that could only be grown profitably with the assistance of slave labor. By outlawing slave labor in the Midwest, the Southern planters protected themselves from the economic competition, and indeed, after the Civil War, some tobacco was eventually grown in the Midwest. Even though he lived in luxury with the aid of slave labor, Jefferson was keen to stop the spread of slavery, and he worked to keep it out of the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Ordinance anticipated many of the guarantees enshrined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights: freedom of religion, habeas corpus, the right to bail and trial by jury, no cruel and unusual punishment, right to enter freely into private contracts, right to compensate for eminent domain, and was not difficult for the commonalities between these two documents. The Northwest Territory was the first part of the United States to be surveyed under the public land survey system. The land was divided into townships measuring 6 miles square. Townships were each divided into 36 sections of a mile square. From this point, land could be subdivided into smaller lots, half lots, or 320 acres, quarter lots, and quarter lots were some of the terms that were used. Each township was required to maintain one section for public buildings and education. The influence of men like Thomas Jefferson can be seen in the system. Such small lots aim to avoid land ownership concentration and promote Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic. The national government and most states' governments owed an enormous debt to the veterans of the Revolutionary War. In many cases, the land was given to them instead of back pay, which helped ease the massive deficit that the new government was facing. Wealthier veterans and outright speculators acquired larger plots and sold pieces of them to more recent arrivals. The influx of war veterans left its mark upon Ohio. For example, Cincinnati was named by General Anthony St. Clair after the Society of the Cincinnati. This was a group of Continental Army officers, led by George Washington, who reaffirmed their commitment to the Revolution's rights and liberties over the lure of power and fame, based on the Roman general example of Cincinnatus. The Shawnee and Miami tribes opposed the new plans and attacked white settlers as they moved into Ohio. At first, they were successful. 2 various militias were raised and sent after the Indian tribes, but both were defeated at the cost of 800 dead Americans. President Washington then became involved, raising a larger federal army and sending them into the area under Mad Anthony Wayne. This army was more successful, winning a decisive victory at Fallen Timbers in 1794. The result of the Treaty of Greenville, in which the Shawnee and others seceded their claim to most of Ohio. As settlements pushed to the west, similar conflicts were fought in the 1800s, such as the Black Hawk War in Illinois. In their objective of promoting egalitarianism, the creators of the Northwest Ordinance were primarily successful. Despite speculation and the inevitable abuses, land ownership was spread relatively evenly across the Midwest, with fewer of the massive estates that came to dominate the southern and eastern regions. Homosexuals in the 18th century. With the establishment of the United States following the American Revolution, such crimes such as sodomy were a capital offense in some states. At the same time, cross-dressing was considered a felony punishable by imprisonment or other forms of corporal punishment. During the 1600s, the American colonies adopted sodomy, or buggery, laws that prohibited bestiality and anal sex between either a man and a woman or between 2 men. New Haven Colony was rare in including sexual acts between women as part of that sodomy prohibition. Punishment, which included death, was draconian, but the laws were very rarely enforced. Historians know less than 10 executions for sodomy throughout the 17th century. Of those few, almost all involved assault or sex with animals. These laws were not directed in any way towards homosexuality. Indeed, they couldn't be. The idea of a type of person who was a homosexual didn't even emerge until the late 19th century, a result of urbanization, industrialization, and the development of medical discourse. But while these laws weren't about discouraging homosexuality per se, their architects sought to regulate sexual behavior more generally by steering sexuality towards procreative marriage, protecting women, children, and weaker men from assault, and maintaining public order and decency. 18th century Americans were even less likely to police sodomy than their 17th century forebears. There's only one known capital case during the 18th century, a slave named Mingo for forcible buggery, and after independence, all 13 states revoked the death penalty for sodomy convictions. However, all adopted laws criminalizing anal sex, whether the recipient was male or female, adult or child, man or beast. Those laws were maintained into the 19th century when used in cases where the sex enacted was either violent or highly public. Immigrants and men of African descent were most charged with the crime, but the general pattern was non-enforced. In practice, police rarely enforced sodomy laws against anyone before 1880, even when such illegal activities were notorious in the community. The notable thing about homosexuality in the 18th century was that it shifted from an action to an identity. The act of sodomy, on which homosexuality was predicated, changed from something one did to something one was, i.e. a sodomite. Homosexuality had been acceptable, even fashionable in ancient Greece and Rome, and Platonic homoeroticism was tolerated during the Renaissance period, especially in Italy. However, the concept of gay orientation did not develop during this time. Engaging in erotic exchanges with other men, whether physical or ideal, did not make a man a homosexual to exclude all different identities. By the 18th century, we can still see some remnants of early tolerance and fluidity, particularly among the elite. The British courier John Hervey was openly bisexual and is thought to have had indiscreet affairs with the Earl of Ilchester and Frederick, Prince of Wales. Though his dalliances prompted some satirical poetry, he never seriously faced punishment or social exclusion based upon his sexuality. In law, however, sexual relations between men remained illegal. The act of sodomy, also known as buggery, was in theory punishable by death. In practice, the more likely charge was assault with somatical intent, which would be punished by a spell in the pillory to humiliate the convicted men. Nonetheless, there was a cautious gay subculture in 18th century London centered around several taverns known as molly houses. In addition to functioning as meeting places for gay or bisexual men, they were also home to discreet drag culture, space for men to dress and present themselves as women. And how were these men perceived? It's worth noting that in the accounts of police raids on London molly houses, the men arrested were from a variety of social backgrounds. Often they were tradesmen, artisan, and apprentices, indeed not members of the fashionable elite. In mainstream popular culture, however, the effeminate, overdressed elite man was a stereotype most associated with homosexuality. In the worlds of music, theater, and visual culture, gayness permeated numerous characters of this type without being explicitly alluded to. The representation of homosexuality in popular culture was coded rather than open, implied by behaviors such as one dressed, stood, or spoke because the actual act of sodomy as defined in law was considered too taboo even to mention by name. However, the one thing that virtually all these representations had in common was their elite nature, connecting wealth, fashion, foreign travel, and culture with the ideas of gayness. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm RyanGLancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.